Hello, it's Scott Manley here, continuing to document my futile attempts to beat the 1 hour mark on the Lunar run. After the previous attempt, I decided to replace the solid rocket boosters with the larger versions, so I went into the user interface and popped them off and replaced them. I, however, forgot to enable symmetry mode, and therefore, about 1 second after launching, I realised that I needed to perform an emergency abort sequence. That actually was pretty clean, other than the ring of fire that I created around the launch pad. Yeah, I just needed to ditch everything else now, which in theory just requires firing the engines and detaching stuff. Of course, never quite goes exactly as planned. Yeah, I could have ditched that in the sea, but you know, this is sandbox mode. It's free for me to replace that launch pad. But more importantly, objects that land in the sea don't make as big an explosion, if any. So yes, leaving these behind, and then watching the boosters continue to fly off into the distance. So of course I knew what was wrong, and with a whole lot of patience I was able to reattach all these things with the correct symmetry. For some bizarre reason it kept on wanting to be symmetric around the strut. Only thing is, apparently by adding all this extra mass, I've confused Kerbal Engineer, and it was completely refusing to give me any sort of delta V calculation. So I was just sitting here watching, guessing, and hoping that things were going to plan. The solid rocket boosters, I pretty much aligned their fuel levels to make sure that they would burn out but a fraction of a second before the regular liquid-fueled engines, and once those were ditched, I got all my details, all my numbers telling me how fast I would go and whether I had a serious chance of getting to the moon. On paper, this does give me a significant increase in my delta V, albeit a bit of a penalty in terms of thrust to weight ratio. Now, what I've done is in the core, right, that small engine there that I'm using to decelerate, I replaced that with the next size down because it's actually slightly better from a thrust to weight ratio in the engine, and more importantly, I actually get better specific impulse, and that gives me the bigger delta V, which means I should have more speed for returning to Kerbin. The big downside, of course, is I had to start decelerating a whole lot further from the moon, almost 2,000 kilometers away before I actually began my initial deceleration. Turned out that I had started a little early, so I kind of rode the suicide burn, calculator, wrote that number all the way down, trying to keep it just above zero the whole way. Notice I'm increasing my thrust slightly as it starts to drop below zero. Obviously you don't want to have it go too far below zero because that would be suicide, technically. There's a reason they call it a suicide burn. Few hundred meters above the surface, my velocity drops to zero, and so I let myself drop and land, and then take off, and then try to land. And then I just decided, let's go home, because we've touched the moon and that's all that really matters. Sure, I could have set myself down gently on the surface and took some samples and stuff, but we want to get back. And yes, we have a faster spacecraft, we have more delta V. Okay, we spent a little more time slowing down, but you know, at the start we accelerated a whole lot faster. How did all these changes affect my final time? Well, I have to say I was certainly interested. I also, of course, did the smart thing that everybody recommended that I managed to completely slip my mind. I took the parachute and I said, don't open the parachute until you're 50 meters above the surface. Also, don't even semi-deploy the parachute until you're halfway through the atmosphere. So that should at least make things a little easier, because the parachute will deploy at exactly the last minute and deposit me gently onto the surface after a breakneck deceleration. One other change that was made was I decided to put the RCS fuel back into the capsule, and then I've attached a couple of those little RCS thrusters, which give me a little extra thrust. Of course, at this point I realised that I should have perhaps I should have put a Sepatron in there so I could accelerate the capsule all on its own. But never mind, we're coming down through the atmosphere, decelerating, Parachute semi-deploys a few kilometers up. And just wait, 600, 500, 300, 50! Crash land! And just under 1 hour, 10 minutes. So that's an improvement, but honestly, it became very clear that I needed to go back to the drawing board, and this is my next generation version. Except that it had some teething problems coming off the launch pad. Yeah, I mean, this is of course running at 4 times regular speed, so you can imagine how slow this was to actually sit and watch this happen in real time. Yeah, everything exploding everywhere. Now, if you look very carefully in that giant morass of exploding materials, you might have noticed that those engines are actually clusters of engines. See my capsule just landing there gently in the middle of the remains of the launch pad. In fact, it buried itself in there. Yeah, surprisingly, the rest of the Space Center was relatively untouched by this mess. So I reset again for another test run, trying to track down the exact problem. Can you see what the problem is yet? It should become obvious once again when things explode. This thing has 1,400 parts, 17,000 tons, and I don't know how many engines on this thing. Those outer boosters have a cluster of 6 engines, all attached using cubic octagonal struts. That gives them 16,000 kilonewtons, or 16 meganewtons of thrust on each of them. And yeah, you can just see the capsule there zipping around, trying to get the capsule out there in a survivable manner. And it does, it comes out. And now the mess is clear. It should be obvious. It should be completely obvious why that thing exploded on liftoff, because there's a pair of boosters there sitting, generating huge amounts of thrust while still attached to their launch clamps. So yeah, check your staging. And after the staging was checked, we proceeded to ascend towards the sky with the moon in sight. This spacecraft had way better thrust to weight ratio. In fact, I had to throttle down for maximum atmospheric efficiency. It also apparently had some issue which caused something to explode. I wasn't quite sure what it was until I looked at their flight results, and it told me that one of the advanced engines collided. So on one side we are missing an engine, and while we were able to maintain control over most of this, you can see that one flies off, and yeah, despite my best efforts, the spacecraft tends to get a bit explodified here. And once again, exploding. I should be a little more careful. At this point I thought, well, you know, we do need to test this whole lander to see whether it can go to the moon. So I fire engines just a touch, ever so gently. We are actually flying upwards, and we'll get to our apoapse in about 2 minutes. And then we just happen to come up pointing in the right direction to go into orbit. Sure, it was a retrograde orbit, but it's not like we didn't have the Delta V. I mean, you can see right now we have something like 13,000 meters per second of Delta V available to us. We could go not just to the moon, we could probably go to practically any planet, well, obviously except for Eve. But the mission is the moon. Why would I go anywhere else other than to show off? And it's not like I haven't shown that I can go practically anywhere given the right amount of Delta V. No, this is just what we're going to do. We're going to carefully deposit the spacecraft right in the middle of the lunar disk here. So firing the engine, now we're going to drop straight down. And then I tell my dude-ass, whatever his name is, to point the spacecraft in the correct direction. Also note the addition of lots and lots of little solar panels and batteries, and you can't really see the landing gear from this angle just yet. The landing gear I have replaced with something suitably strong, but something which is in fact massless. Having no mass obviously helps a whole lot when you're trying to go places very, very, very fast. So here we come down, fire the engines, look at the wobble with the extra power they're handling. And then we ditch them while we prepare for our suicide burn. I think I fired my engines a little too long here because they are just going to fly out of range, unfortunately. They're flying out of range too quickly. There we go, there's the crater, and you can see the shadows appeared for but a second and then they evaporated just before they hit the lunar surface. So didn't unfortunately get to see any explosions of my spent boosters. So from here you can just about see the landing gear is essentially piles of cubic octagonal struts, and that's another optimization because cubic octagonal struts are massless and they're actually pretty tough. So I just had attached them there. Now in the middle also you can see there's a nuclear engine. That means that the nuclear engine stage will burn for a long while, but it does give the whole spacecraft, I think, has about 27 kilometers per second of delta V. So, yeah, getting back home, easy enough. In fact, out of boredom, I thought I would, fire the engines just to make re-entry a little more spectacular. And, why wouldn't you want a more spectacular re-entry? Although, it does technically make it safer because it reduces my velocity faster. Anyway, we ditch those, send them off on their own, because we don't really need the extra mass of those things. We have a parachute to slow us down. The thrust-to-weight ratio isn't exactly greater than 1, but with the parachute helping us, we should be able to make a soft landing in the sea, and then of course irradiate the sea while we're doing it, because it is a nuclear engine. And while the exhaust from a nuclear engine generally isn't radioactive, you can bet that taking a super hot heated engine and then dropping it in cold water probably isn't particularly good for the engine, and is therefore likely to cause fuel to crack and explode and then perhaps fall out. Yeah, you notice that I hit a thrust to weight ratio of greater than 1 just before hitting the surface and managed to smash the tank. That's cute. Well, anyway, back to debugging things, and what I do was I adjust the positions of the engines. So what you do is you use the offset tool and you can drag the engines further away so there's less chance of them perhaps crashing and breaking. Brilliant! So we get through the first couple of stages. This is about 2 minutes into the flight and we're already 100 kilometers up and moving at 2200 meters per second. And a quick check of the map to check we're on course. We return and things just start exploding. Now, there wasn't any staging involved or anything here. What's happening is the engines are too powerful and the radial decouplers actually snapped under the amount of force that I was putting on them. So yeah, having added more boosters, it's time for us to add more struts. I'll of course make the frame rate slower, but darn it, we do want to get to the moon. I mean, well, very specifically, we want to get to the moon in under 1 hour. Yeah, I could have just quit and reset it, but it's always fun to perform the recovery in this case. This thing, of course, was spinning really, really fast, and I had to start ditching stuff. It probably doesn't have enough torque to slow itself down. The first step in this situation is really to try and make the vehicle symmetrical so that we've balanced the mass and we balance the engines. So you see there's like an extra fuel tank on the side there that I need to ditch. Now, it's also interesting to note, although it's not actually symmetrical, but the center of mass is actually distributed correctly. I like also how we're very clearly in this giant, cloud of debris here, and the sun has just risen to illuminate everything. Now, of course, at this point, I could go to the moon, but we're not going to. I could, of course, just let the whole thing fall back and use a parachute to land. That would certainly work. But it would be a really bad idea to fall back inside Kerbin, or inside Kerbin's atmosphere, with all this debris surrounding me. I mean, obviously, it could do terrible things to my parachute if such a thing was actually modeled in the game. But yeah, I just decided to fly around and land on the daylight side because that'll look a whole lot prettier to y'all. I mean, by the nature of this particular challenge, I tend to be taking off at night and then landing on the moon during the day. You know, if you want to land on the moon during the day and have its nearest side, then you're going to be coming from the dark side of Kerbin. Of course, if you perform the gravity turn version, which sometimes may or may not help, then yeah, you can arrange to launch during daylight and land during daylight in both locations. But there we go. Tedlong Kerman. Of course, looking for a nice place to land. Turns out he still has a little bit of engine power left and he uses it to land close to this island. So, the record has not yet been beaten, but I know I'm getting close. Until then, I'm Scott Manley. Fly safe.